Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to take you on an imaginary mission. Once you graduate, some of you, I'm sure, will go into the service. And so this might be something that you encounter in your own life. So put yourself in an imaginary hillside. It's dry, very little vegetation, nowhere to hide. It's about 11 a.m. and it's hot already, very hot. There are 4 of you. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're Navy SEALs. Congratulations. How many people aspire to be Navy SEALs? Maybe I should have picked you. You're on a mission to find, capture, or kill 2 of the most elusive fighters in the Taliban. These are high-up people. They are above the lieutenants who orchestrate the war. These are high-value targets. Now, you've been dropped behind enemy lines. And that is your order. Your order is to find them, capture or kill, and get out alive. 11:15. The 4 of you are staking out a position to figure out where in the village, down in the valley, these guys are. Because you have the intel, they're in the village. 11:30. You figured out your action plan. You know how you're going to get into the village. You know which buildings you're going to take first. Okay, you're ready to go. But suddenly, you hear the bell of a goat herder. And after the goat herder, there are 2 goat herders, after him come a flock of goats. About 100, 150 goats. And they're noisy. And worse than that, the 2 goat herders have spotted you. Remember, this hillside, there's very little vegetation, there's nowhere for you to hide. So you've been made, basically. Your mission now is in jeopardy. For all you know, within 10 minutes, these guys are going to summon the Islamist fighters, the Taliban and their allies, and you're gone. You don't have a lot of time to think. Your mission is in jeopardy. So the 4 of you round up the goat herders, and you sit them down and you start interrogating them. And you're trying to figure out, who are these guys? Are they actually goat herders? Are they out there doing a reconnaissance mission? Do they know you're coming? Are they allied with the Islamist leaders that you're coming to capture or kill? Do they have a blood oath with them, a tribal loyalty that whatever else they may tell you, ultimately they're going to stab you in the back? But you can't get anything out of them. I mean, you have the language, you know how to talk to them, but you can't get anything that you can work with. 11:35. Now, the sun's rising, it's going to jeopardize your mission to go out at noon. So you have a choice to make here. According to your mission and the orders that you were given, the strictly correct military thing to do is what? How many people feel that they have a clear answer? We're not going to ask you what you think your answer is, but how many people here feel, I know exactly what I would do? Raise your hands. It's a tough decision, right? So a few of you think you got the answer. That's good. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I don't know what your answer is. But here are your choices. The strictly correct military thing to do, given your mission, is to kill these guys and hide the bodies and scatter the goats. Go in, execute your mission, and get out. There is no question that that is the military thing to do. Your mission counts on the success of getting in there and getting out and killing or capturing those leaders. That's easier said than done. That is a difficult thing to do, but that is what happens in war. That is what the 4 of you know you have to do. It's 12 o'clock. You're debating the question because you realize, if we do this, if we do what is militarily right and correct for our mission, when we get back home, it might not look the same way to our superiors, because we've also been given another set of orders. The rules of engagement that we've been put under in this mission require that we put a premium on the lives of civilians or apparent civilians, because you don't know in this case if they are or not. So you have this clash. On the one hand, you know that in order to capture or kill your target, you can't let these guys potentially go back and inform them and ruin the mission. You have to dispose of them in some way. And on the other hand, if you do that, you risk coming back home and being thrown in prison for violating the rules of engagement. What do you do? What do the four of you do? I mean, how many people now feel that they have a clear answer to what they should do? Okay. Well, let me tell you that I presented this as an imaginary situation. And I pretended that you four are those SEALs. But this actually did happen. Just a few years ago, there were 4 Navy SEALs. Those exact conditions were in place. And they decided, they took a vote among themselves, they decided that according to their rules of engagement and the policies that they are operating under, they have to let the goat herders go. This actually happened. What followed within half an hour of letting these goat herders go? 100 to 150 Taliban fighters swarmed the 4 SEALs. 4 SEALs over here against 140 over here. 3 of them were shot. By the time the air support came in, they called for air support to get them out. The air support, there were 16 crew on the helicopter. The helicopter was downed. Those 16 men were killed too. Only 1 of the SEALs survived, just 1. And he barely survived. He had to crawl, he had to withstand enormous bruising and injury. Now, that is a horrific situation, horrific. And my hope is that if any of you are put in the line of fire in the future in the service of this country, that you are not put in that situation, that you're not put in a conflict where your mission requires one thing and the rules of engagement, the moral, political ideas that are shaping the policy that the military is fighting under, put you at odds. But my hope, I think, is going to be frustrated. Because unfortunately, the situation I described as happened to these SEALs is not an isolated incident. I wish it were. I wish I could say this doesn't happen, this was an aberration. But in fact, and this is the thrust of my book, and I'll develop this point, the struggle that we're in here is that there's a clash between what a military goal of victory requires, on the one hand, and the political, moral injunctions, the rules of engagement more specifically, that require something entirely different, and something that is in conflict with the goal of success, of victory. So Professor Yu introduced me as having a particular view on why the wars have been going on for so long, and why the outcomes that people had hoped for have certainly not been produced. The basic thrust of my argument that I present in my book, which looks like this if you go to the Navy midshipman store, is this. Our military is enormously powerful. It's the best trained, best equipped military in the world. It can win this war. It could have won already, except for the fact that our policies have crippled our war effort. Our policies as handed down from policymakers, politicians, intellectual leaders. And in effect, what we've done is we've sent our servicemen to fight with their hands tied behind their backs, or at least one hand tied behind their back. We're now busy tying the other one under new restrictions. So let me indicate a little bit of how I got to this conclusion, because it's certainly not obvious. I mean, typically people will tell you, here's what went wrong. On the front end of 9/11, the intelligence community screwed up, right? So they didn't talk to each other. There are all kinds of problems, bureaucratic problems. And I don't want to belittle that. I mean, there's certainly problems in the intelligence community, but I don't think that's the core of the problem. I think there's a bigger issue in terms of how we viewed the Islamist threat prior to 9/11. So I'm not putting the blame on the intelligence community on the front end. I think the analysts were doing their job. They just weren't directed by our policymakers in the right way. But more critically, after 9/11, in response, the military response that we launched, there, the typical argument that you may have already encountered is this. We had the wrong leaders in place. We didn't plan for the peace. We botched some missions. We let Osama bin Laden slip through our fingers. There's a whole raft of arguments, all of which boil down to one thing. The military is at fault. They screwed up. They didn't do their job. We just need to do a better job of the military tactical stuff. And I say to you, and I hope you'll think about this seriously, that that is an unjust, unfair, unwarranted conclusion. And I'm not saying that because this might be your future career. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to win you over. I think that's true. And I tell this to all the audiences I speak to across the country. The problem is not a military one. It is a political one. Political ideological. It's the ideas that filter down and shape military policy. That is what has crippled us. Let me give you some background to how I got to this. So, like a lot of people after 9/11, I was of the view that we had to fight back. There was no question. This is an act of war, and we had to fight back. And I was on the side of fighting back. I thought, okay, now we're going to take care of this problem. We're going to squash the bugs under our feet the way we can. I mean, I felt confident that this wouldn't last very long because although I don't have a military background, I do know something about how strong the US military is. And I'm sure you do probably better than I do. So on the one hand, I looked at it this way. So if you had a scale, right? Over here is the United States military, the Navy, the Army, Air Force. Everything under those headings. What are some of the tools that we have, right? We have the sort of things that 10, 20 years ago looked like science fiction in the movies, right? We have real-time satellite tracking of these people. We have heat sensors from out of space. We can tell you exactly who's breathing in which hut, in which village, of which outpost of Afghanistan. We have aircraft carriers, as Professor Naval can tell you. These things are enormously powerful. We have aircraft that can fly and be undetected by radar. I mean, this is science fiction, space age stuff. And we have an enormously well-trained group of people who operate all these amazing tools. That's what we have over here. Way over there are people with a few cell phones, some improvised explosive devices made out of dynamite, soda cans, fishing wire, a few worn-out Kalashnikov rifles, maybe a few other rifles that they've managed to scrape together. That's it. That's it. Militarily, they're mice, or rather they're cockroaches. There's nothing there. Over here we have what is validly called a superpower. So explain to me, this is the question that I had looking at this since 9/11, how is it possible that the lion over here has yet to conquer and vanquish the mice over here? How is that possible? And I was convinced, because I started researching this, and I said, well, it can't be the case that it's the wrong leadership, because we had a revolving door of different people taking charge, and there wasn't a fundamental change under any of them. The trajectory was the same. The policies were the same. So that was constant, and the results were pretty much the same. And it wasn't personnel, because I think as I found, even if you had more people on the ground, that wouldn't have changed things enormously because they were all operating under the same kind of restrictions. So that might have made a marginal difference, but if you have 10 people who are handcuffed like this, and you bring in another 5, they're all still handcuffed, in effect. So I got to thinking, so what's the same? What's going on? And the clue to the answer came from some of the statements and some of the evidence I saw in how we were fighting. So this isn't that, this wasn't something secret, in other words. I was able to see this without having special clearance or inside knowledge. I was just observing it as an analyst from the outside. And here's what I saw. As soon as the Afghanistan war began, and we'll just talk about that one for today, although the book I cover more than this, on the first day or so of the war, here's what I read about. There was a bus traveling down the road fast. This is all because we have the satellite tracking. We know exactly where these people are. So we see this bus, and we have the intelligence that on this bus is a man called Mullah Omar. Has anyone heard of this guy? Yeah, so he was one of the kind of spiritual leaders of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. He was the man who put Osama bin Laden and the rest of Al-Qaeda under his wing and allowed them to operate in Afghanistan and from there launch the attacks that occurred 9 years ago today. This is an important target, and we knew with certainty that he was on this bus. Now, what happened to Mullah Omar? Does anyone know? Anybody? Well, he's not on that bus anymore. He got off it, and he's living in Pakistan, in Quetta. This is according to the newspaper. He's still alive, is the point. Now, why is he still alive? We had Hellfire missiles pointed at this bus, ready to go, fingers on the trigger. Well, between the point of identifying the bus and having the finger on the trigger, there was a long sequence that went something like this. The person with the finger on the trigger went up a level to say, can I pull the trigger? That person had to go up another level to talk to a military lawyer who had to clear it because this was against the rules of engagement. By the time the cascade came back with the decision, okay, go ahead, the bus was way out of reach. They couldn't get it at this point. So in effect, we had to let him go because the need to make the decision couldn't happen in time. And this is a result of the kind of restrictions that are in place. Now, you have to roll it back because this is just one incident. The other thing I found that really struck me, and one of the other many examples of this, before any US troops even came close to Afghanistan, this is before the invasion on October 7th, there was a big meeting at the Pentagon, and they brought in a lot of military lawyers and analysts to tell them of this long database of target sites, because they have a lot of planning that they do, as you may be aware, to say, okay, here's this list. Here's our list. So we have a long list. It's probably 70, 80 pages longer than this, right? What can we do with this list? Well, let's see. Mosques. Can't target those. Strike it off the list. Shrines. Strike it off the list. Power plants. It's a legitimate target. You want to take out the lights to the extent they have them so that you have the advantage. Strike it off the list. What about places like government buildings? Strike it off the list. And they went down the list, and they created extensive lists, not of targets that they could attack, but targets that they couldn't, because there were more of those. They called them no-strike lists. And they went one step further. They didn't trust the personnel to just follow these rules. They reprogrammed the artillery batteries so that certain targets could not be fired upon. They plugged in the coordinates, and they said, anything within this range cannot be fired on. In order to fire it, you need to get clearance. And that's the way you get the situation like the one I described with Mullah Omar. Look, so you see this happening. And on top of it, you hear what the goal of the Afghanistan war was. I think arguably the goal was, to the extent there was a threat there, we have to go in and crush it. I mean, I think that's a pretty straightforward proposition. Personally, I don't think it was the most important target. I think, and this is one thing I talk about in the book, other nations are much more significant in this conflict, and I would name Iran as the primary. But let's say, for argument's sake, that you think there's an imminent threat of more attacks from Afghanistan. That's a legitimate reason to eliminate the threat. But that's not what we heard coming out of our political establishment. What we did hear is something entirely different. We heard something along this lines. Afghanistan will never be a good place for the people who live there until we lift them out of poverty and give them elections so they can have their own government. This was under George W. Bush, and it came under a larger program that he had, which he extended to Iraq, of bringing so-called democracy to the Middle East and nation building. There's a real question of what if you can build a nation in a place like Afghanistan, but that was papered over. And don't just take my word for it. And here I'm plucking out of some speech, some random quote, and I'm trying to present it to you as this was the actual goal. Don't take my word for it. Look at what actually happened. Why would they have these no-strike lists? Well, the express purpose was to ensure minimum damage in order to facilitate nation building after the war. And on top of this, why would they drop food packages on Afghanistan? Which is what they did. So something like 500,000 food packages just in a week. Why would they drop these food packages? Well, a lot of starving people in Afghanistan, which is true. No one can question that. A lot of very poor people in Afghanistan. But why would you drop food packages over enemy territory? What could happen to some of these food packages apart from the supposed goal of giving them to the starving people? Who else is in the enemy territory? I'm dropping very broad hints. I mean, the enemy is on the enemy territory. And indeed, the enemy benefits from your sending them food, which is what we actually did. We send out these C-17 planes to drop these food packages. This is the trend that I see when I'm looking at this problem, and I'm saying to myself, why aren't we winning? Why isn't this over yet? Well, if you start from the beginning, from the point of we're programming our artillery so it can't target certain things, for the sake of leaving enough there to build a new country for the sake of the poor Afghan people so they can have elections, where's the talk of victory? Where's the talk of defeating the enemy, of crushing the threat to the extent there is one? You hear some of it, but that's not the goal as manifested in action. So the trend that I saw when I looked into this, and this is the genesis of the book, the actual motive, the actual policy shaping what we did was to put the interests and the needs, the welfare of people in Afghanistan and later in Iraq above the goal of our self-defense. So the goal of defending American lives and protecting us from the threats over there was subordinated to these, as I put them, welfare missions. And this is why after some time on the ground, our troops were diverted from capturing the enemy to manning schools, opening them up, opening printing presses, equipping hospitals, clearing out sewers, and starting electrical plants for the sake of nation building. Not for the sake of eliminating a threat that's actually menacing us and that we need to deal with as quickly as possible with minimal risk. So that's the thrust. This is the kind of the main idea that I developed in observing these facts. We were handicapped from the beginning by a goal that subordinated our need of self-defense and put the needs of others, the welfare of others, ahead of ours. This is not a military doctrine. This is a political, moral view. It's a moral idea of putting others ahead of yourself. And I argue, and I hope you'll consider this when you pursue this issue on your own, I argue that that is inimical, that is contrary, that is destructive to our ends, to our own security, our own interests. It has no place. This idea of putting others ahead of ourselves in military context has no place in a military context. That is not what our men and women in uniform should be doing. Here's why. So I told you about those 4 Navy SEALs and the 16 who came to save them. So that's 20. Out of that 20, only 1 survived that mission. And I said that this wasn't an isolated incident. The reason that it's not isolated is all these factors I've described, the restrictions in place and the goal that shaped the war and the motives of the war. But let's just work through what happens when you have these restrictions. So I said, if you drop food, who potentially can get the food? The enemy. What happens when you publicize the fact that mosques and shrines and historical sites are off limits? Where would you, if you were the enemy, you were my 4 SEALs from the beginning, if you were the enemy and you knew that the mosque was off limits to US artillery, where would you hide at night? Where did they hide at night? They hid in the mosque. We have eyewitness accounts of them lying down in their sleeping bags on the floor of the mosque, knowing, I can sleep here tonight. I don't care about the firefight outside. They're not going to shoot me. And on top of it, as things got worse and the restrictions were tightened, they used the mosques as sniper hideouts. Because they knew for the US to be able to fire back in, they would have to get special clearance, which takes time, and that gives them an advantage. So in effect, these restrictions give the enemy the upper hand. They don't have to fight by the same rules we do. And on top of it, we make the rules such that they're against our own interests. They make our position weaker than it is. So it's not merely the fact that they have these advantages, that they can hide in a mosque or use a historical site to garrison their men or put their weapons and ammunition. It's the fact that this gives them a morale boost. If they know that the world's most powerful nation is going into battle like this and like this, that means that their chance, as pitiful as they are militarily, their chances of inflicting pain on us increase. And their will to fight increases because they believe we just poked the lion, we just poked the tiger, and the tiger turns out to be more paper than flesh. Look at that. We, the fanatics of this ideology, the Islamic totalitarian movement, look at what we're able to do. Clearly, this is evidence that our belief system is working. I mean, it's practical. Because we're religious, as they believe, this makes us powerful, because look at what we're able to accomplish in the face of this mighty enemy. So it boosts their morale, it emboldens them, and in fact what you've seen in Afghanistan in particular is the trend line for casualties for the US is increasing very sharply because the Taliban and their Islamist allies have gotten more bold, more fierce. I mean, the kind of attacks that they've carried out they're mind-boggling. There was one I read about. Some of them had been captured and put in a prison. So their friends came and broke them out. How did they break them out of prison? Now this is a heavily guarded prison, right? Enemy combatants are in there. This is near Kabul. They drive a fuel tanker up to the gate of the prison. One of them jumps out of the fuel tanker. The other one fires a rocket into the fuel tanker. Huge explosion. Opens up a hole in the prison wall the size of 3 trucks, and they all run out. Now, no enemy in the world should feel that they can get away with that, first of all. No enemy should have that level of confidence in the face of the United States. And that's just a small one example. I mean, they have these roadblocks where they, in effect, hijack and murder all the people who are driving convoys, bringing supplies. Because they know they can get away with this stuff. They are getting away with murder, in effect. So it boosts their morale, it boosts their ability, because they have places they can take advantage of and hide. I mean, one of the latest things that the troops are complaining about under the new, even tighter restrictions is this. In the past, if they were in a firefight with the Taliban or Islamist fighters in some village, they could call an air support. The air support would come in and kind of help them finish the job if they were at a stalemate. But now it is so difficult to get air support because of the restrictions, they sometimes have to let these guys go. They have to let them go. Just ponder that for a minute. Ponder letting these people go because you can't go after them. You've been not because you don't have a line of sight. You have. You could take them out. Because you're forbidden from doing so. You're forbidden from calling in air support. And in some cases, in order to qualify a certain fight for air support, one of you has to go in to the no man's land in between in order to draw fire, in order so that they can see the whites of their eyes, so they can call in the helicopters. And more than this, it puts the lives of the American soldiers at much greater risk, because if a firefight used to take 15 minutes to finish with air support, now it can take 5 hours. Or it could just peter out and these guys get away to fight another day. This all magnifies their strength and weakens our position. And one of the things that it does more than this is it makes the war unending. It destroys the morale of our people, both at home and on the battlefield. And ultimately, it makes the enemy stronger. Now, I lay the blame here at the feet of those who tell us that the goal should be nation building. It should be bringing benefits to these people rather than destroying the enemy with minimum risk and with the most efficient means possible. And I argue that this is a moral view that's shaping policy and thereby shaping military conduct. Let me say a word about that, because it might sound strange to say that, because a lot of people have a view that to say something is moral or ethical, there's basically just one view that people have of what's right and what's wrong, right? But in fact, that's not true. There are different views of what's right and wrong. Let me give you a parallel to illustrate this point. So, I take it everyone here has studied US government in high school, at least, if not here at the academy. You know that when the founders were creating this country, one of their projects was they looked through history to see the different kinds of governments that people had. They saw the Athenian democracy, they saw absolute monarchy, which they definitely saw the flaws in. They saw all kinds of tyranny. And in the modern world, you know about communism, and presumably you've heard about other forms of government. So you see, in the field of political theory at least, there's a whole range of ways in which people form governments, right? There's our way, there's the communist way, there's the having kings and queens and so forth. That's true in politics. It's also true in morality. There are different views of morality. The conventional one, the one that's now in force, some of you may have heard of this, in military context is known as just war theory. That is one view. And I argue that it is the wrong view. I argue that we do need morality in war. We do need to guide our military projects and initiatives by moral ideas, but different moral ideas. Not ideas of the kind that we have now, because there are good ideas and bad ideas. And you can see by the consequences that the ones we are following today, the ones that require you in the battlefield to put the lives of your enemy and the people surrounding him ahead of your own, that is a destructive moral idea. And I say we need to question that. And one of the reasons that the title of my book is Winning the Unwinnable War is that I suggest that we can win. We can make these wars end, we can victoriously, if we question the views now in place and adopt better views, more American views, views that genuinely take our national self-interest to heart. And I conceptualize that. The way I define that is a policy that doesn't put nation building and welfare missions first, but a policy that puts our security and the lives of Americans, both in America and in the battlefield, first. Now, I call this view, this view comes from a broader view of morality, and it's based on Ayn Rand's views in morality, and hers are what she describes as rational egoism. And this is one of the points I develop more in the talk, and I encourage you to delve deeper into it so you see that in the context of military action, morality is crucial. There are important questions that have to be answered. You have to have these principles to guide you. But having the wrong principles, as I argue we do today, can mean that you never come home from that hillside. It can mean a war in Afghanistan that is now the longest war in US history. Longer than the Vietnam War, longer than the Revolutionary War. That is a consequence of having policies that restrict our ability to achieve our own ends. Policies that put the needs and welfare of others first, as opposed to our own first. Now, I don't know exactly how much time you have to do your own reading. I understand your time here is very structured, and I know that you came here after another lecture. But I want to plant this seed in your thought. You know, I speak to college-age students, college students all over the country, and I tell them that contrary to what they may think and what they may hear, our nation still is at risk from attacks. And I tell them that it is in their own interest to find out more about how we got here, the road to 9/11, and why it is that that road is continuing and we're still under threat and it hasn't ended. And I tell them that it's imperative for their own future and the future of their children, if they have them, to understand this and to take action to reverse course. I tell them that because, like all Americans, it applies to them. But in speaking to you, I was thinking on the way here that this matters even more to you. I mean, you're not just the future generation of Americans who will be voting and holding down jobs and building businesses. Some of you, I understand, will be those SEALs. Some of you will be those commanders and admirals who are putting into place certain actions and battle plans. You need to understand the ideas that guide the policies that you're handed down from the Pentagon and from the White House. Because your lives and the lives of your men will depend on it. And your success is what our security, my security, the security of my wife and children, and of my neighbors and friends, we're counting on you. So I want to plant this seed in your thoughts to the extent that you have time and interest. I hope you look into this more. You think about it more, investigate exactly what we have done, so that first you can reject the unjust attacks on the military that present the military as the source of the problem for these unending wars. And second, that you gain some knowledge about what we could be doing. What is a truly pro-American policy? And what are the moral ideas that can lead us there? And part of my reason in coming here is to suggest that some of those answers can be found in the book that I wrote. And you may not agree with me, that's fine. I just want to bring those to your attention because, in my view, it matters a lot. And it matters to you personally a lot. So, as I said, I speak all over the country, but coming here was both a privilege and one of the most important things I've done this year, because it enabled me to speak to this audience, which I have enormous respect for, and I want to be able to bring to you these ideas because I think it matters for you to think about them, in the hopes that if you agree or disagree, you'll be able to carry on your careers in a way that best advances America's security in our lives. And with that, I'll close, and I'll take some questions if you have them. Thank you.
So do you think that the same restrictions would be implemented in the rules of engagement if we're fighting a more conventional military force rather than people that hide in the mountains and everything?
I do. I think so, because it's a trend that began. Please feel free to see. I don't know what the convention is here. If that's okay. I do think so, because the trend didn't begin with the Afghanistan war or the Iraq war or even 9/11. If you go back, another example that is really striking in this vein, I mean, it goes back at least 50 years, if not longer, but here's another example. In the 1980s, the US sent forces into Lebanon to help. Pardon? Welcome. I'm glad to see you. The US sent troops into Lebanon to help keep the very precarious peace that was, well, it was not really peace, but there was a civil war, and they were sent in as peace monitors, kind of, not exactly to be part of the war, not exactly to watch. The rules of engagement that they were under were in some ways more strict than they are in Afghanistan. So they were told to, if they had handguns, they had to be unloaded when they were out on patrol. And then, as one account puts it, for them, the conditions under which they were allowed to use their weapons were more restrictive than someone in the United States walking down the street where you're allowed to have concealed handguns. But so I think in places like Texas, I don't know if it's still true, but when I lived there, you could have a concealed handgun. And there were certain conditions under which legally you were permitted to bring it out. The troops in Lebanon had even tougher restrictions. Now, the enemy didn't hide in the trees or didn't hide in the mountains. He was in the streets. He had embattlements over the Syrian border that we knew where they were coming from. So, and the broader point is, I think it's important that while the enemy looks different and operates differently, I don't agree with the people who say it's a different kind of war. Because one of the points I make in the book is, it's a mistake to see the enemy as just terrorists. The enemy is an ideological movement. I call it Islamic totalitarianism. And it's funded, it has been funded, it's encouraged and supported ideologically and materially by certain states, principally Iran, but also Saudi Arabia. Pakistan is a state sponsor of the Taliban and still is, despite what they say. If you see it as a movement that has state sponsors, that changes the way that you can deal with it. Instead of chasing down what people think of as just a loose affiliation of people in the desert of Afghanistan, you take a step back and you say, well, where did this movement come from? Who's backing it? And how do you stop it? How do you stop their will to fight? And part of the answer I provide in the book is, you have to destroy their ideal. You have to teach them that what they hold out as achievable is unachievable. And part of why they think it's now achievable is that their ideal is embodied in certain regimes like Iran and Saudi Arabia. They think, well, look at Iran. It's getting away with snubbing the United States, defying the United States. Well, our goal is achievable. The people who support our idea are getting away with this sort of thing. And there's a whole history behind why they think that. But the point is, in thinking about the enemy, it's crucial to see that it's not different in kind. It's different in some details and tactics, but that the way to deal with it isn't that different. Yes, sir?
Sir, if you're saying that we should put aside just war principles and put aside humanitarian concern for the needs of the nation, at what point would you draw the line? So, are you encouraging that we use thermonuclear weapons and turn the Middle East into a parking lot? Or are you saying that there is a certain line we should cross there?
I can take your question. So I do think there are lines we have to draw. So my point, I want to make sure that when you leave this room, you do not think that I'm against morality in war. I'm against a particular view of morality in war. I think we have to have very bright lines about what we do and don't do in combat. But those lines have to be drawn in accordance with the principle of what is in America's self-interest. So you asked me about the specific, would I encourage using thermonuclear weapons? I'm not a tactician. I couldn't tell you if that's the best way to do it. But if somebody made the case that in confronting Iran, for example, that is the best means of eliminating the threat, if you believe there is a threat there, I think that that is justifiable. And let's put it in a different context. War is about destroying the will of the enemy to fight, so they do not fight you anymore. Now, the means by which you do that can vary. I mean, before there were nuclear weapons, there were really bloody wars that went on for a long time because you just had to keep fighting on. But in Japan, when we used 2 atomic devices, that saved a lot of American lives, which is something people don't realize. It ended the war. Had the war continued, and I refer you to historians of the subject in particular, many more Americans would not be alive today, and their children would not be here. So the issue is, when you weigh that kind of calculus, what tools should we use? There might be pros and cons of using nuclear devices. I'm not wedded to it. I mean, maybe you do need it, maybe you don't. But the question is, how do you decide that, and where do you draw the line? And I say you do it by the principle of what is the best means, the most efficient means of eliminating a threat, an objective threat to the United States? And so in some cases, the answer might well be yes. In some cases, no, because the costs would be not worth it. There might be more efficient ways of doing it. And one example, to go back to the case of making the Middle East a parking lot, which I don't really like that way of thinking, because that's not a goal. I mean, the goal is to eliminate threats, not wholesale destruction. But take the issue of Iran, right? A lot of people are wondering what will happen if or when Iran admits that it has nuclear capabilities. Well, people argue that, you know, sending a nuclear device into Iran is just going to make it worse, right? Because they have nuclear devices and you just have a bigger disaster. Maybe the best way to deal with it is to implode all of their nuclear facilities underground, and as some people put it, turn them into tombs, right? So people can't get in, can't get out. Now, so that might be a more practicable way of dealing with it. But so see, the consideration is, how do you judge it? And then there's a later consideration, what's the best means of doing it? But the answer is, we definitely need to take assertive military action. And I leave it to people who are better informed on the means to decide the specific means that are efficient. Yes?
Sir, you said that you would loosen the rules against the enemy or whatever. And the question I had is kind of like an example. Like you said that if we were to use the objective of the war is to make the enemy lose the will to fight. So by broadening our targets, or I guess untying that one hand and opening the targets up to, let's say, less of a spectrum of the enemy, but now civilians of, I guess, like the Afghanistan civilians who have become targets too. If someone came and killed your family, would that make you lose the will to fight, sir? Would you not want to fight that? What I'm saying is, if you start killing civilians over in Afghanistan, would that not stir the hornet's nest anymore? Would that make them not more willing to fight? And what I'm saying is, like, as leaders, we're taught to look after our supporters. We're taught to look after people, not other than just ourselves. And I think that when we're over there, we're not just fighting for the United States, we're fighting for the people who live there as well. So by opening them up and targeting them as well as the terrorists, as well as the enemy, not only does that kind of take away from the reason why we're there, but I feel like if the roles were reversed, or however you want to put it, like, it just kind of seems, I don't know.
Okay. I think I take the thrust of your question. I can say a few things in response, because there's a lot you raised, and if I don't cover everything that you raised, just remind me, but I'll try to address what you raised as completely as I can. Number one, I don't think it's true. Okay, number one is, in war, it's unavoidable that civilians who are innocent fall under the gun. That's unavoidable. And I argue, part of what I argue in the book is that by trying and bending over backwards to avoid that, we're harming ourselves. And I think morally, so this goes to the real thrust of my point, and I'm glad you raised it. This is a moral question. What is appropriate for us to do in war? And the argument that I'm opposing is we have to hold back in order to benefit others and so forth. And I say that's not true. And I'll give you some evidence for why I think it's not true, so it doesn't just seem like he says, she says. Here's a piece of evidence. Just look back in history. And I think it's true, and it applies in Afghanistan and other places too. The populace can be more or less sympathetic to the cause that is fighting from that area. So like the Nazis, they had a lot of popular following. The Japanese imperialist regime not just had popular following, it was a kind of state religion to believe in this war effort and so forth. I mean, to the extent that children in school were made to recite daily that if it came to it, they would put their lives down and so forth. It was seriously inculcated into their thinking. And when you have that, so these are the sort of people where the argument you present would be the most forceful, right? So if it's true that by killing civilians in Japan, we would make them even more eager to fight back, that's just historically not true, because what happened is because we were so forceful and we brought the pain of war as in the most real way possible to them, that did break their will to fight, and they stopped fighting. And on top of it, once the war was over, they came out in the streets to thank us, to say, we're so glad that you shook us out of that weird ideology that we had and made us rethink these ideas. Because that's what you want. You wanted to say, we're not going to do that anymore. That led us to destruction. We have to rethink that. And indeed they did. I mean, Japan completely turned itself around. And I think that there are very few wars in recent memory that were as brutal as what we did in Japan. So my argument is that it does serve our interests to pursue that, even if it means civilian casualties. In Japan, there were many more, by orders of magnitude more, civilian casualties than there have been in Afghanistan. So it's an unavoidable and unwelcome fact, but it is a hard fact. And the attempts that are well established to avoid it, so the attempts that are enshrined in the doctrines that I'm critiquing, the attempts to circumvent that fact are self-destructive. So that's one point. The other is, it goes down to what you think the enemy is about, right? So if you believe that the enemy is motivated by certain ideas, it's only when you show them that their goals are unachievable that, okay, so the enemy is, there's a small nucleus of leaders and ideologues and so forth, and then lieutenants, and then there's some foot soldiers, and it's like this concentric circle. That's one model that people use. And the idea is, it's the people in the middle, the hardcore, who operate and encourage and so forth. How do you get at them? Well, you can go after some of the foot soldiers, and that's important, but you have to break the will. You have to show the people in the middle that they're after a lost cause. And once you do that, the people on the outside who themselves may not be fighting, but they either condone it or they enable it. So for example, if you offer a safe house, or if you offer your cell phone for use by the Taliban, or if you in some way even passively allow them to continue in your village, you're part of the problem. And to get those people on the margins to change their mind doesn't take a lot, precisely because they're on the margins. So I think that it's the opposite. It's to the extent that they see us as winning, they would rather be on our side than against us. Because if it's true that, as you say, we should be fighting for their liberation, I think I'm maybe putting words in your mouth, but that's kind of the concept. The people who most want to be free of the Taliban should be the ones telling us where to target. They're the ones who should be helping us in the same way and for the same reasons and with the same fervor as the French resistance in World War II. And if you know some of the history, the partisans. These are people who, they weren't fighters, they weren't even soldiers, they weren't trained. They trained themselves. They went into the woods. They stole guns where they had to. They brought old guns where they had. Some of them were farmers. They're not sophisticated people. They went out and tried to ambush the Nazis. They went out and sabotaged train lines. These were people who helped the Allies target on the ground, knowing that as civilians, as partisans, they may well suffer when the bomb lands because it's in their village. So what I'm suggesting is that the way we conceive of the people on the ground has to be colored by what they're actually doing and where they stand. And to the extent they can, they need to stand against the enemy that we have and welcome our defeat of that enemy. One of the things that people forget about Afghanistan in particular, because the argument you raised is a very live one, and a lot of people think it has merit. The critique is the more America has civilian casualties in Afghanistan, the more they hate us, the more trouble that creates for us. The truth is, and as I say, it's an unwelcome fact, so I'm not here to cheer for civilian casualties, far from it. I think it's a horrible fact of war. But here's a fact that people need to be aware of, and that I hope you share this with people who you speak to them. The Taliban's rate of civilian casualties versus the US rate is 4 to 1. 4 to 1. So on the logic of this argument, they should be much more fiercely against the Taliban than they are against us. And yet they're not. In fact, they're not. So there's a question of how much of it is sympathy or cowardice, and how much of it is agreement, how much of it is, you know, there's a real question. So there's a moral question about the status of those civilians who don't go into the streets to protest the 1,600 civilians who died that year at the hand of the Taliban relative to the 356 or so, I forget the exact number, at the hand of the US, where the US, as I've been arguing, goes out of its way to avoid this kind of thing, whereas the Taliban and the other Islamists don't go out of their way. They seek to destroy civilians in order to blame it on us. So on the logic of that argument, why aren't they against the Taliban? Why aren't they fiercely pushing them out of Afghanistan and not welcoming us? I think there's a lot to think about there, and it goes down to what you actually, what are the moral ideas shaping that analysis? So I hope I've covered everything. It's hard to remember all the details of the question, but are we running short?
Well, no, I think we're done.
Okay.
Give him a big hand. Well, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and for any of you who are interested, there are a couple of books that still are yet to be signed by Elon, and if you want, you can pick them up and I'll sign for them after the lecture. Well, I also want to give you something for thought.
Thank you.
This is a paperweight with the seal of the United States Naval Academy.
Thank you.
Put it on that big stack of papers that are on your desk, and keep us in mind. And thank you very much for this lecture.
Thank you. Can I have just 1 minute? I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was going to be, that's the end. I just wanted to offer my thanks to you for your attention. And when Captain Manville raised the possibility of coming here, I was very excited for some of the reasons I mentioned, because I believe that you are, for the kind of material I deal with, I think you are the most important audience in many ways. And it didn't occur to me until closer to the time that I would be speaking on 9/11. And I just want to take a minute of your time and just have you, just to underscore the need to reflect on these issues, and to thank you for your keen interest in the security of the United States to the extent that you've signed up here. And it's been my pleasure to speak to you and answer your questions. If any of you are interested in further discussion or you want a copy of the book, please contact me. I'm happy to discuss further, answer questions, and so forth. So thank you for this, and it's been a pleasure.